Okay, well, last time we spoke about Mishumer Nevad. It means if a person didn't follow the din of Shemitah, he either guarded his produce or he worked the land. And that the short version of it is that those are mutter b'diavad. Okay, the Mishumer Nevad, the din Lamais is that it's mutter. Now we're going to talk about more serious issur. We just mentioned it in passing last time, and that is Sefichin. Okay, and Sefichin is that what the word Sviach is used in the Torah. It says a Sviach Sviach something. Okay, anyhow, it says it uses the word Sviach regarding Shemitah, and Sviach means something that grows by itself. Okay, something that grew by itself. No one planted it. So the Min HaTorah, the way we pass them, Min HaTorah Sefichin Mutter. Okay, something that grows by itself on Shemitah, no one did anything wrong, it just grew by itself, it's mutter. The Chacham were concerned that people would plant things, and they would say, "Oh, it grew by itself. I didn't plant it. It just grew by itself." So that would be their own. They would pretend that it had grown by itself. So Chacham said anything that needs to be replanted every year, and anything that needs to be planted, if it grew by itself, it's also anyhow. So that means is that vegetables and spices and grains and herbs, all these kind of things that every year you have to replant them, then they're issur. Even if they grew by themselves, they're issur anyhow.
Why did they make it there like that for this specific?
Very good question. So some, I wasn't sure if I should say this and ask.
Why they're playing somewhere a person can do something wrong and say, "Oh, just have me like that."
Oh, okay, I misunderstood your question. Someone asked from Zaman, he said, "How come Meshumah B'Nevad are mutter and Sefichin are issur? Why did Chacham issur one and not the other two?" That they asked in this question. Correct. Guarding your parents is also mitzrayim, and not letting anybody take your parents is also mitzrayim, and working the land, it could have been anything, whatever you did. Maybe you pruned your grape trees, and so then those players don't get issur. So why not? So he said, what's the difference between them? Okay, so I would have thought the answer to the question is by Sefichin, if not for you, there wouldn't be a plant altogether. Okay, Sefichin means that someone planted it, not that it was Mishumer B'Nevad. It's just the plant was there. And if he did the wrong thing, he may have made it been better fruit, made a little more fruit. But if I planted tomatoes, if not for me, there wouldn't be any tomatoes. Okay, so I can see that as being more serious.
When were these planted? Before Shemitah?
No, on Shemitah.
How they grow?
Tomatoes?
Yeah.
Plant tomatoes.
You know what?
Water, sun.
Sefichin was on what?
Things that grew by themselves.
Yeah, how common is that?
Oh, it's very common. Seeds get left on the ground. Yeah, things just grow. Yeah, just the other day I passed fields that were growing one thing, and there were pieces of corn growing up in the middle of it. And some seeds fall on the ground. They just grew. So the issur is that I would have planted. If not for me, there wouldn't be any corn here at all. And now all of a sudden there's corn growing here. So that's maybe. Okay, but Rosh Hashanah says the answer. He explains it like this, just for your curiosity. He answers like this. He says it's for two different reasons. He says Mishumer. The reason why they didn't issur is because when someone would guard his field and not let somebody in, that's a very public thing. You don't hide that you're being shown your field. He says, so there's nothing to be geyser on. We're not geyser for the person doing it publicly. We're being geyser for someone who's trying to surreptitiously. He's just trying to sneak it by and not let anybody know. So
surreptitious.
Okay, however the word is. Okay, whatever.
Serendipity is something.
Okay.
Serendipity is Sefichin, things that grow on their own.
Okay, fine. And he says Nevad, the reason why they didn't issur Nevad is because if they would issur Nevad, things that people had worked the land on Shemitah, they would have had to issur. That means if a person would have worked his peach tree, they would have to issur the tree. Well, that would have this really long-term effect on the person. It would be issur for years, forever. Because if he did work on the tree, if they issur things that someone had done work on the land, they'd have to issur something like that would mean issuring the tree for good. And that kind of like too serious. So since to issur Nevad, they would have had to issur the whole item, not just, if you grew a tomato plant, they could issur the tomato plant. But Nevad on a tree means a long-term thing. They don't want to make it so far, so they didn't issur it. That's what he says. Okay. So whatever the answer is. So this issur called Sefichin is probably the most serious issur people have to consider when they go out to buy food on Shemitah. Okay? Again, Mishumer Nevad doesn't issur the food. But if I want to buy food and it's potentially Sefichin, then that's for most people, that ends up being the most serious thing that they have to do. Today, we're going to talk about how Sefichin affects, how the issur of Sefichin affects, I use the word consumers, but I mean people who consume the product, how they have to think about that, which is how we usually think about it. Next time, Mitzrayim, we're going to talk about Sefichin, how that affects farmers. Some very unexpected things from next time about how Sefichin affects the farmers. Okay, today we're talking about people who want to use the Sefichin, okay, which is what most of us think of. Okay. Okay, so knowing what the svara was, why they asked it Sefichin, they asked it Sefichin because they were afraid people would plant and pretend that it had grown by itself, plays a big role in the dinim. I'm going to give you 5 applications that the svara has in making the din. Okay, how the logic for the issur plays a role in the details of how the issur carries itself out. Okay, so the first one is something you would guess, which is, well, since the issur is because people might plant something and pretend that it grew by itself, therefore it only applies to things that get planted every year. It doesn't apply to trees. Okay, so oranges are not Sefichin because nobody plants oranges every year. You don't plant orange trees every year. You have to plant tomatoes every year, but it doesn't apply to things like fruits. Now, in that...
I'm missing something is right with Xera.
Again?
The Xera is that we're afraid someone's going to plant something and then say that...
Pretend.
So what's the point of the pretending part?
Well, because he looked like a bad person had he planted a whole field of corn. So instead he just says, no, this stuff just grew by itself. He doesn't look bad. He's walking around at night dropping seeds on the floor.
People might plant things.
Right? Is it serious? So how will they stop people from doing that? So they stop by saying that even if it grows by itself, you can't eat it. So you would have nothing to gain by that. No one's going to buy your stuff, or you won't be able to eat it yourself. You'll look bad.
They see it's grown on Shemittah. They see it's coming up on Shemittah, so you know.
So say, oh, that must be us. Don't take that in. You can't eat it.
It's in the field. It wasn't 6 years old. It grew on Shemittah.
Okay, so now, in this rule, for these rules, it depends on what has to be planted each year. It does not depend on, for hilchos brachas, what's considered a pre-ha'etz. Okay, so, and the example is, some talks about this, you have bananas. Okay, bananas, we pass in the din of der hadama. But for these purposes, they're not in the din of Sefichin because you don't plant banana trees every year. They grow for a number of years. So therefore, a banana, in this respect, bananas are like trees. That they make a bar priyadama, but they are like trees in that they don't get planted every year, and therefore there's no chashash that if I see a banana growing, I say, oh, we have to worry that someone planted it this year. Okay, and similarly, berries, which we also make hadamas on, also they grow for a number of years, so they're not in this gzera to say that they should be issur because someone might have planted them, because they're the kind of things that grow for many years rather than something that grows just for one year. Watermelon is a plain old hadam and it gets planted every year. Yeah, planted every year. It's like you put seeds in the ground. It grows on the floor. Okay, now the next thing is there's a mission that refers to something, but everybody calls it the Avodas. 4 types of fields. There are 4 special fields, 4 unusual fields. They're the types of fields that nobody plants anything on. And since nobody plants in these types of fields, therefore there's no issur Sefichin for things that grow on those fields. Now, it sounds very odd what I'm saying to you now. I'm going to save it but for next time. Next time I'm going to hear about the very unexpected nafkamina that came out of this din. Again, the issur is because you might plant something. If it's a field that nobody would plant on, then the Chazal didn't ask for those fields. Okay, we're going to find those Avodas that have a special nafkamina. What? That depends. It depends on whether there is. We're going to talk in a second about whether there's a kedushas shevi'is to that. It depends on that. If it is, then it is. If people plant it, then people plant it. If people planted it and it's considered something with kedushas shevi'is, then it is. This is not. These are types of fields, not like issur. This is not types of fields that nobody would plant in. Okay? We'll do it next time. Okay, it's a mission. We'll talk about it next time. Okay. The next thing is, what happens if you have foods that usually are not cultivated? Okay, it's the kind of foods that grow wild, and nobody ever makes an effort to cultivate these fields. Tomatoes are cultivated, and cucumbers they are, but there are things that grow. Yeah, I was going to say that. Give me a second. So the Mishnah's got a long list of foods that are like that. Okay. The Mishnah's got a long list of foods. I was going to say, just give me a second. The Mishnah's got a long list of foods that are included in this. Okay, but the list of foods is not important to us, even if we can figure out what all those words meant. It depends on what practically in your day people do or don't cultivate. It doesn't really depend on what is. So even if we knew what all those words in the Mishnah meant, it wouldn't be so negative to us. Some of them we do, but and because of what I just said, Reb Chaim Kanievsky talks about it like this. He says mushrooms are something that grow wild, and it used to be that they were known. There's no such thing as cultivating mushrooms, and people would just eat mushrooms. However they found them, they would eat mushrooms. And since it was like that, he says it used to be that, he has a long claim about this, but he says it used to be l'chayra that mushrooms would qualify as something that grows wild, and that there's no issur Sefichin on them because they grow wild and nobody cultivates them. They qualify for this thing.
This is kedushas shevi'is on mushrooms. We say not yonkim and avir, right? And it's a mekasha hakol on mushrooms.
I don't remember. I think he talks about that. I believe there are. I believe he talks about it. I don't remember. I don't know what he says. But he says, but nowadays, we don't. The bulk of mushrooms are not eaten. Are not the ones that grow wild. The mushrooms now are very much cultivated. People have whole factories, or if you want to call it that, farms, factories of making mushrooms. And therefore, he says, even though in theory 100 years ago it might have qualified for this thing, nowadays it doesn't. Now, that said, so this reason for why mushrooms shouldn't be sveichin doesn't apply anymore. But if you remember, we have a combination of a few things. When we learned Hilchos Toilarim, we talked about the way they grow mushrooms nowadays. Okay? And the way they grow mushrooms nowadays, in some of the ways that they grew, we spoke about it then, some of the ways that they grow mushrooms qualify as Atashen and Akub and Zereh Papayas. And we talked about a few times ago that things that grow in the greenhouse may have no kedushas shevi'is to them. And we're going to talk about in a minute that things that have no kedushas shevi'is also don't have issur sveichin. Okay, so if we put all the pieces of the puzzle together, if we have the right kind of a growth that qualifies for a thing that would be Zereh Papayas and Atashen and Akub, like in the right kind of ways, then it won't have kedushas shevi'is and it won't have issur sveichin either. Okay, I hope I didn't lose everybody on that one. Okay, so Chaim is talking about from this cheshbon, should it be considered not sveichin because it grows wildly and no one cultivates them? But he says it doesn't. Nowadays it doesn't. But it might qualify from a different reason, from the way we grow them nowadays. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to say was, what Rabbi Zimmerman said was, an example of things that nowadays that we don't cultivate is dandelions. Okay, everyone's got dandelions on. I shouldn't say that. I'm insulting you. I've got lots of dandelions on my grass. Okay, growing wild on my grass. They're all.
I have my gardener cultivate against
them. Okay, we got lots of dandelions growing all over the place. There are people nowadays who consider it medicinal, and there are lots of people who eat them, or eat parts of them, or make teas out of them, all kinds of things that they do with them. So that would qualify as a food that the bulk of dandelions are not, no one's cultivating them. I guess maybe there's a farm out there that grows dandelions. Baruch Hashem, we grow plenty of them. So we those kind of foods, would not need the issur sveichin. Okay.
We used to watch people. Remember that? We used to watch people. People would come by, just 3-4 older European kind of, walking by with a bag and walking through all the fields.
Really?
Pulling up the dandelions, putting them in the bag.
Really? And then they build you for gardening. Right? Okay, fine. Okay, the next thing, the fourth opinion is like this. Yerushalmi says like this. Yerushalmi says, declares about it and basically comes to the conclusion that there's no issur sveichin on teven. Okay, what's teven? Teven is, in English, is straw. Straw is, used for we need it for this case, to understand that straw is when you have a grain growing, if you cut off the top of it, the part that you want to eat, the stalk, the grassy part of it that's left is called teven. Okay? It's not eaten by people, it's ma'achal behema. So, the Rash Cirilio, in his Pirush on the Yerushalmi says, what the Yerushalmi is talking about is there an issur sveichin on ma'achal behema? Okay, we know that issur sveichin on things that we eat, but the shaila in the Yerushalmi, which in the conclusion is that there is not, is did they make the issur of sveichin on ma'achal behema? Now, ma'achal behema has kedushas shevi'is to it, not just ma'achal. The ma'achal behema also has kedushas shevi'is. But the clear of the Yerushalmi is, did they make it a gzera of sveichin on ma'achal behema also? And the decision is, no, there's no issur sveichin on ma'achal behema. That's what he says. The Chazon Ish says he doesn't understand it. He says, what should be the difference? If the issur is, they issur the food because you might plant it, well, people plant things for their animals also. Animals have to eat, so people plant for their animals. So what? In Svara, there's no reason why ma'achal behema shouldn't have the same thing. But that's a logical question, he's saying. But then he brings a bunch of rayas that it's not correct. A number of rayas that show that really there is an issur sveichin on ma'achal behema. One of them I'll mention to you is, there's a din, we're going to talk in a second about what happens for produce that grows into the 8th year. Okay, and it technically does not have the din of sveichin on it. We'll talk about that in a second. But technically, it doesn't have the din of sveichin, and the Rambam brings over there that because it's technically not sveichin, you're allowed to let your animals eat that produce. Since it's technically not sveichin, we'll find out in a second what it is. It's technically not sveichin. Animals can eat it. So he says. So you see that if not that it was sveichin, if not that it was a special category of the 8th year, you would not let your animals eat it. You see that ma'achal behema is an issur sveichin. Okay, so he has a few rayas like this. That
these animals eating ma'achal also.
Yes, you could argue like that. So he says that he has a few rayas. Like each one of them, you could talk about them, and he argues that there is an issur of sveichin on ma'achal behema. Rosh Zalman accepts that. He takes what the Chazar says at face value. And Tzitz Eliezer, he's not so convinced. He brings a lot of others who argue on this. I mean, the Rosh Hashanah is the obvious one who argues. He's right there on the Gemara. Others don't like that. And I forgot to explain to you. The Chazon Ish says, well, what about the Gemara? The Gemara is talking about Tevin. This is what the Gemara is clear. It's like this. Tevin is a byproduct of the grain that grows on the top of the stalk. So the grain on the top of the stalk, is issur as Sefichin. That's for sure issur as Sefichin. So since the main part of the food is going to be issur as Sefichin anyhow, you didn't have to be worried that someone would plant tevin just for the stalk of it, because the main part is not going to be edible anyhow. The main part is going to be issur. So since the main part will be issur, Chacham didn't need to issur the stalk also, because it's only a secondary part. So tevin and a few other cases that the Gemara brings are all secondary to something that will be issur as Sefichin, and therefore it's mutter. What happens if I have something that's completely meichel behema? It's not secondary to the meichel behema. It's the whole plant is a meichel behema. Then the plain old zero applies there. Okay, so tevin is a special case. Tevin is not an example of meichel behema. It's an unusual meichel behema, which is a byproduct of a meichel adam.
So you're saying the initial zero was on the
No, nobody would plant. The Chacham are making a zero because they're afraid you might plant.
Right.
If we say if you're going to plant wheat and you're not going to be able to eat the wheat, so we don't need to ask for the grain. The stalk. No one's going to plant the wheat just to get the stalk out of it. If I'm not going to be able to eat the wheat part of it, they don't have to be. You don't have to ask me on the stalk, because I wouldn't plant it just for the stalk. I can't eat the wheat anyhow. Just for the stalk, I wouldn't have done it. If I was doing something else that is just for animals, growing alfalfa just for animals, then maybe I planted alfalfa just for my animal. Then you have to be geyser on it.
Again, the question at stake over here is the shevi'is in general, not the
No. There is kedushas shevi'is on Michael Behemoth, for sure. Yeah, that's for sure.
Is there shevi'is?
Is there Sefichin on it? So Yerushalmi seems to be asking that question: is there Sefichin on tevin? So Chazon Ish said no. But Yerushalmi is saying is like this: of course, there's an Sefichin on Michael Behemoth, but here the Michael Behemoth is only secondary to the real thing you're planting. Therefore, then the Chacham didn't have to answer that because you wouldn't plant it just for the secondary part. So that
why would you not allow to let your animal eat Sefichin as opposed to every other issur in the world that you let your animal eat?
Good question. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Okay. Good question. I'm not sure. Look, last thing is like this.
It has nothing to do with Kashrus to the animal.
Right, okay.
It has nothing to do with Kashrus to the animal. It's with the land and walking.
Okay. Our last nafkamina before we move on to the next part of this is that we're going to find out when we talk about kedushas shevi'is. When we talk about kedushas shevi'is, we're going to find out that there's a very pretty well known, a big machlokes as to whether if a guy owns a field, whether in Eretz Yisrael, whether his produce has kedushas shevi'is or not. We're going to talk about that when we get to kedushas shevi'is. Everybody agrees, that there is no issur Sefichin on that produce. Okay, so it may have kedushas shevi'is, but all agree that there's no issur Sefichin on that produce that grows by a guy. The reason is because, Ram explained, the issur Sefichin is because you might go plant it. And since you might plant it, Chacham said, we're going to ask the food so you won't plant it. Well, those kind of rules of, we're going to ask you food if you can plant it, don't affect the guy. Let him plant whatever he wants. So he's not kidding what Chacham said. He doesn't mean anything what Chacham said to him. So therefore, there's no point to ask her something that grows in a guy's field. There's no issur Sefichin on what grows in a guy's field. So, because of this din, that there's no issur Sefichin, one of the ways that people in Eretz Yisrael who don't use the heter mechira, how do they get fresh vegetables? The way they get vegetables is one of the ways that they do it is they go to fields that Arabs own. Okay, they go to the West Bank, somebody just go to Gaza, and you go to a place and they go to them, the guy's growing tomatoes, and they buy tomatoes from him. Okay, it's not issur Sefichin. It may have kedushas shevi'is, we'll find out about that, but that's livable, so to speak. I can deal with that. But if it would be Sefichin, I couldn't eat it at all. They go to fields to Goyim and they buy food from them. So
how can you say that it would be Sefichin? They cultivate it, they plant it.
They for what?
Why does the whole question of Sefichin come in?
Well, if I grew it myself, of course it's Sefichin. Sefichin is, even if you didn't grow
it yourself.
What?
You didn't grow it yourself, the guy grew it.
Right, so if it's not growing by itself, if it just grew by itself, let's say I have just in my backyard, plant just comes up. That's issur. So the guy is not worse than by itself, you know? Okay, so
if the only is issur Sefichin, and then how can you buy it from there?
So we talked about that last time. We finagle your way how you buy it from the Arab. Okay, you find your way how to get it from the Arab, how you give them the money. There are ways to deal with that part of it. But that's like sort of, that's workable. But if it would be Sefichin, it's just issur. I can't do anything. There's nothing. Okay, so now, one part that has to do with this thing is, the sitting in this room is, that this needs hashgacha. If I'm going to say I'm going to go buy cucumbers from an Arab, okay, well then, you have to make sure you're really getting it from the Arab. And if I walked over to his field, I could get it. But if I'm buying it in the market, obviously you understand what's going to happen. The Yidden who can't sell the produce are going to give it to an Arab and tell him that he should sell it. Okay? So it needs hashgacha. It needs hashgacha to make sure that it really is grown by the person, by the guy. That's obviously, okay? And that depending on how security goes there to show whether that's possible. Can you send a mashgiach really at the farms to make sure they're really bringing his cucumbers and not the Yid's cucumbers that he just diverted to this person? Okay? That's what. But there was a more fundamental issue. Okay, this first happened, the way it seems to me, in the Shemitah in 1910. Okay, better 100 years ago. Okay, tough Reishain. Okay, it was this is the year that first happened, and Rav Kook wrote a letter, a listening letter. You'll see here, so it works. About doing this thing. Okay, you could read it as it goes by. What do you say? I try and slow down, you should be able to read it fast enough. Okay, you can read it, I'll give you a second. It'll take 35 seconds. Okay, the time is going to stop in the last paragraph, so you can read the last paragraph. Okay, so he says, Cook says, he says, I can't, he says, I don't understand. He says,
to buy from Jews and give...
No, he says, how can you go buy from the Arabs? How can you support them? He says, here we are trying to build up the issur. We're trying to support people living in Eretz Yisrael, and by going ahead and spending money to go buy from the Arabs, he says, you could read it. I mean, he goes on and on. I'm not as poetic. But you could read what he has to say here. He can't imagine how somebody could do something like this. That he can't imagine how somebody could possibly go ahead and buy from the claim. And really, what's going on here is like this. What's going on here? He's writing to Reb Chaim Berlin, asking him that he should stop people from doing this. Okay, Reb Chaim Berlin, if I understand correctly, was the head of the Ada at that time, or from the heads of the Ada, from the old issur, and he was trying to get him to stop these people from doing this. Okay. So what's going on is like this. There's a fundamental issue, we're going to talk about it when we get to the Het Mechira. It's going on like this. There's an issur in the Torah of Sefichin. We're going to talk about it when we get to Het Mechira. Which is, you're not allowed, one of the things that means is you're not allowed to give goyim hana'ah b'karka. You're not allowed to help establish a Eretz Yisrael. You're not allowed to sell them land. So the people who don't want, like the Het Mechira said, it's an issur to sell the goy a piece of land. You're saying, take my land. There's an issur, they say an issur deraisa to give the goy a piece of land. Good. So that on the, if I could use the word, on the technical, what it says in the Torah says, don't sell them a piece of land, and you're selling them a piece of land. And Rav Kook's argument was on the other side, which is from the hashkaf of it. What is the Torah saying? It says, don't let the goyim have a beachhead in Eretz Yisrael. Don't let them in. Keep them away. He says, so by supporting their economy, you're building them up and making it easier for them to stay in Eretz Yisrael. So maybe on the technicalities of it, you haven't been you didn't sell them a piece of land. But what you're doing is giving them a foothold in Eretz Yisrael, giving them some kind of support. Well, if you're doing that, that's the Torah's point, is it doesn't want the guy to live in Eretz Yisrael. It's supposed to be a place for Yidden. So by doing this, you're supporting the living there. So from the hashkafa of it, you're being over on Sefichin. Okay, the other side was, well, from the technicalities of it, we don't want to be around the technicalities of Sefichin, which is the settlement. Okay, we'll get to it.
Just against it. I mean, what was the alternative? What was the proposal? It wasn't like you can get it from Jews. Well, undermining the Jewish. I missed this. The undermining the Jewish with the kuf?
Always done with the kuf.
Hakatan.
Well, I've done it before.
I don't know why. I don't know whether.
I don't know whether Hakatan is the one in the front.
I don't know why there are two of them. I don't know. I was wondering.
Someone typed them, and this is not his handwriting. All right?
You sure?
Of course. Look at every top.
I'm joking. We just found a nice font. It looked like
it's a nice font. It's very nice.
Okay. But we typed it. Yeah. Okay.
Because we typed it. Maybe it should be then. Cook is what he.
I looked at it. It doesn't
be Cook at the bottom. It says a Cook at the end.
I'll look at it again. Hey, okay. Yeah. So
what's the alternative? What do you want?
So, well, he wants. I don't know if you read the beginning. We finished the siksuk of Shemittah. He said, "What he said is, don't eat vegetables. Go out for chutzar. There are other options we'll talk about when we get to the here. But okay, fine. Okay, see now, I want to tell you a few other details, and not so much to get to the reason of Sefichin, but I have to do with it. The first is like this. We had mentioned some time ago that the issur Sefichin does not apply to the lands of olei Bavel. Okay, there are parts of Eretz Yisrael divided into two parts. We said then, the olei Mitzrayim, the olei Bavel, the parts that were captured when the Eden first came to Eretz Yisrael, and the smaller amount that were captured by the olei Bavel, the smaller amounts, to the issur of Sefichin does not apply in the lands that are only from the olei Mitzrayim. I got that backwards. From the olei Mitzrayim. Okay. Now, we said when we looked at then that the only lands that we can say with certainty are those lands are the ones in Ever Yardin. Okay, and Ever Yardin, of course, is controlled by Goyim right now. So it doesn't help us. This din is not going to help us. There's no issur Sefichin on the lands of olei Mitzrayim doesn't have such enough community because in Goyim's lands is anyhow no issur Sefichin, and all the lands of Ever Yardin on the other side of the Jordan are all controlled by Goyim anyhow. So it doesn't really help us. If there be a Yid who owned a farm in Jordan, then we'd have to deal with it. Okay, fine. Now the next thing is like this. The Rambam says his words are in this din is Kol hasvichin asurim b'achila. Okay, that's how he says Kol hasvichin asurim b'achila. So the Shar Melch says, he's medayik from that, he says, the Ram says, it's all issur b'achila, mashma, that there's no issur hana'ah on tzvichen. There is an issur achila, but there's no issur hana'ah. And the Chazon Ish accepts that, and many accept that this deal that the Shar Melch makes. But Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, I don't understand. He says, I believe you. He says, that it's mutter b'hana'ah. He says, but what exactly hana'ah did you have in mind? Okay, and I'm going to list you off now. For each one of the, he says, he brings a riot that each of these is true. That all the following hana'ahs are all issur. He says, we can't feed it to animals, that we spoke about. You can't plant it. You can't sell it to Goyim. You can't use it for medicine. You can't use it to dye clothes, and you can't make it to make clothes. He says, so exactly, each one, I'm not going into them, but each one of them has a riot. Each one of them that is true. He says,
the reason why doesn't issur?
What?
If it's mutter b'hana'ah, why would those be issur?
So he says, well, what does it mean that it's mutter b'hana'ah? He says, okay, you tell me mutter b'hana'ah. He says, but all these things.
Why can't you dye clothes? Why not?
I don't want to get to him. So each one of them he has a right, so why not to do that?
So it's right. So I know.
Right. So he's nicely. Okay, wait. Time out. Okay. What's going on here is like this. The Chazon Ish took what the Shar Melch says. Okay, so it's if you look at the Sefer, he doesn't ever argue the Chazon Ish. Okay, so it's not a matter of he can't say the Chazon Ish. He says, but I don't get it. He says, I don't know what the Chazon Ish is talking about. He says, because what hana'ah did he have in mind that you're allowed to do? All these, most of the signs are actually from Chazon Ish. So that's a question. He's certain fire you can't use it for, and certain you can use it even if it's also hana'ah. Okay, so he comes out there, so he says he doesn't get what kind of hana'ah are we talking about that it's mutter b'hana'ah. If you want to say you're right. All these could tell you that it's not issur b'hana'ah. That's true. You want to say it's mutter b'hana'ah, but what hana'ah are you going to do with it? So the one he can come up with is you can't sit on it. Okay, it's mutter b'hana'ah means you can sit. You put bags of bags of watermelon seeds on the floor. You can sit on it. You're right. You can sit on his watermelon seeds. He's not so convinced. Okay, but Reb Shlomo Zalman and Reb Asher Weiss asked very similar questions to this, and they have a different hesper, which fits in with what we said beforehand. They say like this. They say, it depends what kind of Sefichin you have. If you have Sefichin where the hana'ah is the primary use of the Sefichin, like for example, alfalfa is meant for animal food. So the primary way you use Sefichin is you have hana'ah from it. You feed it to animals, or you dye clothes, or whatever the different things are. The primary use of this thing is for Sefichin, is for the hana'ah, then hana'ah is issur. If it's only a secondary use that you have hana'ah from it, that's when hana'ah is mutter. Which fits in with what we said beforehand, which is, when Yerushalmi said that Teven has no issur Sefichin on it, it's because they only asked it the issur Sefichin on the primary use of the food, because figuring, if you won't be able to use it for the primary use, you would no longer plant it. If it's only a secondary use, they didn't answer it. So it's not that hana'ah per se is mutter. When hana'ah is secondary, which it often is, if you have a corn growing, the hana'ah you can have from corn to light it and make my menorah out of it, that's secondary to the fact that I want to use it for eating. So the secondary use is sort of like Teven. It's not that hana'ah is really mutter. It's when hana'ah is only secondary to the main way you use it, that's when hana'ah is mutter. Okay. Two other things like this. If things that are Michael Adam and Michael Behema have kedushas shevi'is. Things that are not eaten by people or by animals don't have kedushas shevi'is. So you have a tree that doesn't have any fruit, it has no kedushas shevi'is to it. So
flowers.
We're going to talk about flowers. Flowers not for now. When we get to kedushas shevi'is, we'll talk about flowers have a special rule to them. Today, we're not talking about flowers at all. The person will assume that something that has no kedushas shevi'is has no issur Sefichin on it either. Okay, now that point that I just said is not completely logical, because the issur Sefichin is how more afraid you would plant something. Well, if I plant this thing for some other reason, I don't eat it. Let's say I like to look at it. Okay, I plant it for, well, why wouldn't they be kedushas that I plant those? You're not allowed to plant those things on Shemitah either. You're not just not allowed to plant food items, not allowed to plant anything on Shemitah. So why would they kedushas that I plant that also? But seemingly the svara is that if something doesn't have kedushas shevi'is, then it's not in the rules. It's out of the book. The book, these are the things that our Shemitah applies to. If Shemitah doesn't apply to it, then all of them of Shemitah don't apply to it, even though the Sefichin rule should have applied to it, because Sefichin is really so that you won't plant. But somehow, if it's out, it's out. Once it's not the rules, these are the things that have kedushas shevi'is. That's like what counts. If it doesn't count, then it's not included even for the Sefichin part. Okay. One last thing is,
what do you do with Sefichin?
you actually have to destroy them. Okay?
But it has to do with shoes. You can't destroy it.
So there's a question. That's a good point. The Kashrus talks about that. Are you allowed to destroy Sefichin b'yadayim because it has kedushas shevi'is and now destroy kedushas shevi'is? But on the other hand, because the Chacham answered this food, then by its nature it's not edible. It became not edible. So now things that are not edible you're allowed to destroy. The Kashrus isn't so about that. Whether is there an issur to be ma'avid Sefichin b'yadayim? Okay.
Does that mean it no longer has kedushas shevi'is?
That we're going to get kedushas shevi'is. Or right to bed. We'll talk about that. Okay. So that's the question. Okay. You would think now we had said some time ago that the way you decide the status of a vegetable, I mean the status is how do you decide whether it's a Shemitah vegetable or not Shemitah vegetable? It depends on when you harvest it. Okay. So if you have tomatoes that are growing and you pick them from the field today, then they're 6-year produce. If you pick them in a month from now, they're going to be Shemitah produce. Okay. If you pick them in the 8th year, they're going to be not Shemitah produce. It doesn't matter when you plant it, it depends when you pick it. That's the year is defined by when you pick it. That would mean is, and I just told you that if there's no kedushas shevi'is, then there's no Sefichin either. So that would mean is, if a tomato plant was started growing on Shemitah, and I picked it after Shemitah, what Shemitah did? You say, well, it doesn't have kedushas shevi'is, because it's picked after Shemitah, it depends on when you pick it. I picked it after Shemitah, it doesn't have kedushas shevi'is, it shouldn't have this Sefichin on it either. I just told you that if there's no kedushas shevi'is, then there's no Sefichin either. So if I pick the tomato on Tzon Gedaliah in a year from now, it shouldn't have kedushas shevi'is. Okay? So, in fact, that's not the truth. Okay? That's the letter of the law.
That if I can have hana'ah, something that's also doing kedushas shevi'is while it's still on the tree, you should be able to do it. It's still on the bush.
Because?
It's not kedush until you pick it. It doesn't have kedushas shevi'is until I pick it.
You mean if I can enjoy it while on the tree?
Yeah, if I can do something for the carrot while it's in the ground.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure.
If I pick it in the 8th year, it's not kedushas shevi'is.
Okay, it's a good question. I'm not sure what this sounds odd, right? It sounds odd, yeah. I'm not sure. Okay, so even though in the letter of the law that's correct, the Chacham were afraid that people would really pick things at the end of the 7th year, and they would hold it off until the 8th year. That's what they would do. So Chacham made a rule. The following, so it has a Sefichin-like rule for a little bit after Shemitah, and that is like this. You can only eat vegetables after Shemitah if you meet one of the 3 criteria. The first is, any of these are good enough. The first is, if there's any possibility that it came from Chutz La'aretz, you're really allowed to eat it. Okay? Again, it was picked in the 8th year. Really, it was picked in the 8th year. Well, the produce that's out there was picked in the 8th year. But it's issur to eat it, unless there's a possibility it came from Chutz La'aretz, then the Chacham weren't worried. Another is, if it's already long enough after Shemitah that people could have planted after Shemitah and it would have grown by now. Let's say tomatoes take 3 weeks to grow. I don't know. Let's say it takes 3 weeks to grow. So 3 weeks after Shemitah, you could eat these tomatoes, which are actually from during Shemitah, because there was enough time that someone could have planted them and they would have been harvested by now.
If you know that they were actually...
No. If it's enough time that it could have grown by now...
But you don't know that these are picked on Shemitah, but it's been 3-4 weeks, and therefore...
You're like that. And the last thing is, if it comes Hanukkah, once Hanukkah comes, you let anything. This whole doesn't apply once Hanukkah comes, just like a cutoff. It's like 2 months after Shemitah, just a cutoff. After Hanukkah, you can eat all these things.
So even if you don't know when it was, maybe it's picked in the 7th year. You don't have to know.
After Hanukkah, you don't have to know.
I don't remember about that.
What if it's the type of thing that most likely actually been there Hanukkah, it's still picked in the 7th year?
I don't remember that. I don't remember, yes. I remember. Okay. I don't remember. Okay. I have to just tell you, but the opposite case, what happens if I planted something today and it was picked on Shemitah? Okay, will be for next time. It fits with what we talk about next time.